Everyone, and welcome. We're filling up from the waiting room as we speak. I think I know most of our delegates on here this morning, but for those of you I haven't met, my name is Anne Dixon and I'm the Director of the Chief Executives Forum. We kicked off this exit interview series in late 2019, and we've been really delighted with the reaction to these events that we've received so far. There's clearly great value in hearing from our colleagues as they step down from leadership positions at that point where the experience is still fresh in their minds, but they have the space to share their reflections more frankly and freely. So the last exit interview we hosted was with Noel Lavery on what turned out to be a very fateful Friday the 13th of March 2020. And that is the last event that CEF hosted in a live setting. Life has changed for us all since then, but I'm really pleased that we've found a way to maintain an element of connectedness across the public sector as we work our way through the challenges we're all facing at the minute. So it's my very great pleasure and indeed privilege to welcome you all here today to hear Sir David Stirling reflect on his professional journey that brought him to the post at the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. And whilst he has concluded that part of his career, we're absolutely delighted that the first position David took up after his retirement was the chairmanship of the Chief Executives Forum. So our plan for this event had always been to host it in the magnificent surroundings of Titanic Belfast, which is a really important part of David's legacy in the public service. Obviously, that's not possible, but I do hope your surroundings today are equally comfortable. I'm going to hand you over now to our trusted host, Nick Garbett, to lead this conversation with David. Of course, as always, we're keen for this to be an interactive event. So if there are any questions, comments, or reflections that you'd like to put to David or to share with the wider group, please jot them down on the chat function, and we'll come to those after the conversation with David and Nick and give you an opportunity to come in at that point. We'll also record this event for our website. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Nick and David.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. It was interesting to listen to you reflecting on the last of these events with Noel Lavery. In fact, that was the last time I shook somebody's hand, and also the last time, possibly the last ever time that I've ever had a buffet, which just shows how much things have changed. So just one quick thing about the sort of rules of engagement, if you like. We hold these sessions, just to remind you, under Chatham House rules. So we'd be very grateful if everybody in the conversation could abide by that. So I'll get on with it, and thank you very much for coming, David. And I suppose the first question I wanted to ask you is one that I know that quite a number of your former colleagues would be very interested in the answers to, and that's what it's like actually stepping down from a position, a very high octane position like yours. What are you doing now, and how's it been actually adjusting from being in charge of everything to not being in charge?
Okay, well, look, thanks, Nick. And first of all, I just want to thank everybody for attending this morning. It's been quite impressive to see so many people that I used to work with, and I'm quite grateful for everybody for joining. I suppose in answering that question, I don't want to sound too smug, because so far I haven't seen too many downsides to retirement. And I look around this morning and I see an awful lot of people who are probably still leading very stressed lives. So I don't want to overdo this, but I have actually, I have enjoyed retirement so far. I think it's now, 5 months I'm away. The lockdown is obviously frustrating, and all the travel plans that I had, or that we have had, we've obviously had to set to one side. But allowing for that, certainly, if I look at some sort of key metrics, my stress levels are lower, my blood pressure's down. I've actually managed to lose a little bit of weight. I'm taking more regular exercise, and I feel fitter and healthier. I'm sleeping better too. I found it nice to take life at a slightly slower pace. It's nice just to get up a little later in the morning, to be able to spend time just doing the simple things, have a cup of coffee, read a paper, read books, that sort of thing's been all been very good. the absence of holidays has been disappointing, but I suppose it has forced us all really to just look and see that there is so much beauty around us. And, you know, I'm frustrated that I don't get out in the golf course, but certainly doing a lot of walking, a bit of running and that sort of thing, and that's all good. Some people did sort of warn me that, you know, there'll come a time when no longer being responsible you might feel there's something missing in your life. And a very good friend of mine who had a very senior post in the public sector said it hit him hard 3 or 4 months afterwards that he had this sense of no longer feeling important. As my wife would often say, you got to remember you're no longer the big bejesus. I have to say that moment hasn't hit me. And one of the things that I think has helped with that is I have taken up quite a number of roles. I'm on 4 different charities. Anne and Pamela are keeping me busy with the Chief Executives Forum. So, you know, I have something to do pretty much every day. And I'm actually quite enjoying that because I'm doing things that I'm interested in through Ulster Wildlife, Cancer Fund for Children, Women in Business, Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and the Forum. So, yeah, so far, so good.
Well, thanks. I guess one of the things that most of us would be most keen to learn about is a bit about your vision about leadership. You know, your own style of leadership, how you led, how you think leadership should be offered by people, and also perhaps as well, you know, particularly in terms of running the civil service, what the sort of balance should be between technocratic competence, if you like, and charismatic leadership.
Well, I think probably you need a bit of both. I have thought quite a lot about leadership and about what works for me, and I guess I'm sort of an intuitive leader. You know, my leadership style has probably been based on my experience of what works for me rather than what I've, for example, read in a book. I don't have a favorite management guru or anything like that. And indeed, one of the things I think relished over the recent years was that as a senior team in the civil service, we were able to spend a bit of time together and just think about leadership and what have you. And one of the things that I thought was useful was we sort of concluded that when you boil it down at its real simplest, our job as leaders is really to make it as easy as possible for our people to do their jobs. And a lot of that is basic stuff about giving people clear direction, giving people the resources to do the job, giving support and feedback when needed. But I think from my own perspective, when I've sort of analysed my own approach, I sort of came up with a number of questions which I find it's useful to ask yourself as a leader. And if you don't mind, I'll maybe just run through those. You know,
oh, sure, please do.
I had 7 questions, but for the sake of brevity, I've boiled them down to 5. And I think the first is really about authenticity. And I think it's really important that, you know, when people look at you as a leader and watch how you behave, it's what you see is what you get. And the most important thing in that regard, I think, is that as a leader, you really need to live up to the values that you espouse. Some of the most demotivating people that I worked for in the past were people who didn't live up to the values that they espoused, and I found that really difficult. And I learned from that, and I learned that, as I say, you have to be authentic in that regard. And that means following through on your promises, you know, delivering on what it is you say you're going to do. And the second thing is, again, it's quite related, and I think self-awareness is really important. You really need to have a very clear sense of the impact you have on others. You know, most people will be familiar with Maya Angelou's comment, you know, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people never forget how you make them feel. And I think that's really important. I think it's absolutely essential that you inspire and motivate. And again, that you're authentic in that regard. And again, there's a lot about team in this. You know, you need to make sure that your team is going to go the extra mile for you. And that means I think your behavior needs to be predictable and not volatile. You need to be someone who people can, when things are going wrong, you need to have people in your team who feel that they can come to you and that you will be helpful and supportive. Third thing then is really, when you become more senior, you will find that the things that you need done or that you want done aren't things that you're totally responsible for yourself. In other words, you're going to rely on others, and you're going to rely on people over whom you maybe don't have direct authority. So maintaining relationships, managing conflict are really important. And I think it's really essential that you have got empathy in that regard. You need to sort of be sure that those whose cooperation you need are going to want to do business with you. And if they don't, you need to understand why it is that they're not doing what it is you want them to do. And I think that, as I say, is where empathy comes in. You really need to be able to walk a mile in other people's shoes, see the world from their perspective. And I think when you are able to do that, it's much easier to work with them to find solutions and help them deal with the things that maybe they're uncomfortable with. And I think as well, we run up against conflict all the time. And I think as a leader, you need quite often to be the adult in the room when things get feisty, not the person who always has to have the last word. The fourth thing, again, is all about team. And I think I've always tried to ask myself, will the team be in a better state than I found it when I go? And in that regard, is the team going to be better balanced? Is it going to be more productive? Is it going to be more diverse? Will the people in the team be encouraged and supported to be creative and to do things on their own initiative? Because I think these things are really important. So, the fifth thing then is really just in and around being a role model and having a good work-life balance. And I think, if we learned anything over the last year, is that we need to look after ourselves and our people. And that does start with yourself, is you do need to find time just to make sure that you get that right balance between work and resilience, etc.
Sorry, I'm very conscious that I've been plunged into darkness, and yes, I think that we've got a comment. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
When I said you need to be conscious of your impact on others, I was thinking that's quite dramatic there.
Can I just ask quickly on that, David? Where you say that it's very important to be the adult in the room. I would imagine that there have been some incredibly stressful situations that you've had to deal with over your career, and I'm sure everybody else in this conversation have as well. Do you have any particular techniques to keep calm? Because it's not an easy thing to do, is
it? No. You need patience, and I think I wasn't always patient, but I think by and large, when things get difficult, I think you always need to allow people to express opinions, but you need at the same time to ensure that you step in when things get difficult. Some of the most difficult experiences I would have had would have been when, for example, a minister or maybe an advisor is cross about something, and you can find all of a sudden, your door opens and somebody sort of says, "Yeah, this is ridiculous. What are you going to do about this?" And you're not even sure what it is. That's the problem. And my experience in that sort of situation was always, you just got to be calm. You've got to say, look, okay, I'm not over this, but let me just understand what the problem is. And okay, how can we make it better? And just always try and just be calm in a situation like that. And I think it's the same at meetings as well. Is you have to allow people to express opinions, but at the same time, you have to sort of exert a certain amount of control so that things don't become unnecessarily difficult.
Okay. There was something else that really struck me in what you were saying as well, and that was in relation to work-life balance. How do you actually achieve any form of work-life balance in the kind of role that you've had and a lot of people on this call will actually have? Because it seems to, the reason I asked that question, it seems to me that the sort of, the pace and the pressure is mounting all the time on senior people. The days are extending. If you think about the media operating 24/7, what respite is there? How do you get some kind of balance in your life?
Yeah, and it has been particularly difficult over the last year, and I'm sort of hesitant to talk about it in those terms because I've been sort of largely out of that since the end of August, and I'm conscious that at that stage we felt, we really are close to the end here, and yet 5 months on, people are still having to work pretty much 24/7 and in a very strange working from home environment, which can be good for some people but not so good for others. And certainly my own experience was it's simple things. It's like you do need to take breaks. You need to continue to look after yourself physically as well as mentally. I found I may have been in breach of the regulations, but taking walks, walking the dog, there's no problem was more difficult to solve after a long walk. I have to say, I've always found that just some physical exercise does make a difference. I suppose being quite candid here, I learned a few years ago that actually when things are difficult, like for me, and everything is personal in all of this, but there would have been a time maybe 10 years or more ago when I would have found, a glass of wine in the evening was becoming closer to a bottle in the evening, and I cut that out during the week. And I certainly, for me, I found that alcohol was something that actually made problems worse. There was nothing worse for me than having a couple of drinks and then you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and the world can seem a very dark place. So personally, I left alcohol until the weekends. But it's also making sure that you allow plenty of time for family and friends, and sort of not shutting that off, because I think you need that just to ensure there is a bit of balance. And indeed, family, there's nothing like family to just remind you of how important you really are and what the really important things in life are as well. Okay. So no, I have no super solution to this particular challenge, but I think it is, as I say, it's just important to talk to people as well.
Yes, and I suppose that brings me on again. Sorry, we're going. I'm going quite literally dark at the moment, but I think we're going to get these lights fixed. But without wanting to go into too much of a dark place with all this, just one further thing I'd be fascinated to ask you about in relation to this is sort of loneliness. In that, did you ever feel lonely when you were, when ultimately you were the person who's responsible for everything? And I'm sure it's something which other leaders in the room must feel from time to time. How did you cope with that, and how should that, are there any techniques that you have, any advice that you would give?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I suppose I would first have come across that as a permanent secretary. When you do all of a sudden find that actually there's nobody up above, there's nobody you can turn to, and you feel that as well as head of the civil service. And again, dealing with that requires some of the techniques I talked about in terms of personal well-being and resilience. I suppose one thing I learned over the years, and there's no doubt experience and maturity can be really helpful in all of this. I learned a long time ago that you can't be happy all the time. Unless there's drugs or something. But, that sort of state of nirvana where, things are never bad, it's just unrealistic. Life is full of ups and downs. And the thing I always found was when things were difficult, because I'd been through difficult things before, I knew that things would get better. And I always found that was really helpful. And, again, occasionally you'd wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you'd think, oh my God, this problem is intractable. And then I would remind myself, no, you will find a way through this. You always do. And, talking through things, working with people, you get through things. I remember one particular occasion where I did feel very lonely. It was particularly testing. This was back in March 2018, and it was St. Patrick's Week. And on the Tuesday, I had been before the RHI inquiry, and the line of questioning that day revolved around note-taking. And the Department for the Economy's witness statement had a line in it that not all meetings with ministers had records for them. And I was asked about this, and the transcript of that discussion runs for some 18 pages. I was quizzed quite hard on this. And at one stage, perhaps a little clumsily, I talked about how we had got in, that the habit of minuting every meeting with ministers had lapsed. And I talked about how with devolved ministers, you'd more access to them, meetings were more informal, all these things. But in the middle of it, I said, and as well as that, I'd said DUP and Sinn Féin are sometimes quite sensitive to criticism. So sometimes to give ministers space, you wouldn't necessarily record everything that's in a meeting. Now, I'd also said as well that I was quite clear that important decisions all did need to be recorded. Anyway, I didn't think much of it, but Stephen Nolan picked up on this. And the next day, I was due to fly to Washington for the St. Patrick's Week sort of jamboree. And of course, in the absence of ministers, I was representing the executive. And this was particularly difficult because I had to fly out on the Wednesday. Nolan Show was running this. They were looking for comments from me. I got off the plane, was taken straight to my airport and had to go straight to the Ireland Fund's gala dinner. And at that dinner, and I'd only had time to change into black tie and all the rest, I bumped into Michelle O'Neill and Mary Lou McDonald. And to say they were unhappy with what I'd said was an understatement. And I won't repeat all that was said, but it was a dark moment. And I remember thinking, oh God, I've got to, if I don't have the confidence of these people, I cannot do my job whenever they come back. And I remember that night, I was due to give a speech at the Northern Ireland Bureau breakfast at 8:30 the next morning. And I remember a combination of jet lag and thinking about this. I slept hardly at all. And I was absolutely dreading having to give this speech to 400 plus people, and it was sort of the cream of Irish America. And I remember speaking to somebody back home, a work colleague, and saying, look, I thought I had quite a good speech, and it was knockabout stuff. It was, there was some heavy stuff and some light stuff. And I said, I don't think I can give this. I think I can, all I could do is give a very short thing. And they said to me, no, you'll be fine. And I probably gave one of the best speeches I've ever given. It was very, very well received. And I discovered that day, that I had a certain inner resilience that I was able to draw on. But that night, lying in my hotel bed that night was one of the loneliest times I can remember.
That's a really fascinating story. Thank you for that. I was going to ask you as well, if I may, because I think this would be something which we'd all love to hear, is dealing with the unforeseen. And I'm thinking specifically about COVID-19, the pandemic. In fact, the last time I saw you was at that very function with Noel Lavery. I think you were going off to an RHI thing afterwards. But then, what was it like actually dealing with that? Do you have any interesting little vignettes or stories of experiences that brought it all home to you. And do you have any lessons, or do you draw any lessons from that we can actually take forward?
Yeah, I think you've always in a leadership role, and I think this applies just as much to politicians as to officials. Expect the unexpected. Harold Macmillan said, "Events, dear boy, events." And I think again, I can think of a couple of occasions where things have happened that have taken me by surprise, and yet I've had to deal with it very quickly. I suppose the COVID one was on the 12th of March last year. The executive had begun to get its head around how it was going to deal with the pandemic. And one of the critical decisions they had taken was that they weren't going to close schools. And I remember getting a call from Martin Fraser, who's the Secretary General in the Taoiseach's office. And Martin said, the Taoiseach's going to be announcing in the next hour that we're closing our schools down. And as you'll recall, this led to a sort of fracture in the cohesion that we'd seen in the executive up to then, because the Deputy First Minister had called for, more or less immediately called for schools to be closed here as well. First Minister was opposed to that. So alongside that, obviously, we were having to move very quickly to a situation that, although we had done some preparatory work for dealing with the pandemic, I don't think any of us had really appreciated just how difficult this was going to be. And it was another one of those sort of moments where I was in my office. I think this was the week beginning the 16th of March. I think it might have been the day after St. Patrick's Day, which is probably the Wednesday or the Thursday. One of the people in the office said, First Minister would like a word, and I was on the phone at the time. I said, "Yeah, I'll be down in a minute." And 30 seconds later, the First Minister wants to see you now. So I went down in the castle, and I thought, "Oh, okay." So I went into the First Minister's room, and one of the private secretaries in the way in had just nodded their head in a sort of way as if to suggest this might not be good. And I was confronted with the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, the two junior ministers, and all the advisors, no officials. And essentially, they said, "David, I'm paraphrasing a little, have you got a grip of this?" And it was one of those moments, even when I repeat it, I can feel the blood sort of draining a little bit. And, to be entirely honest, had the administration really done everything it needed to do at that stage? No, it probably hadn't. We were not as well prepared as we should have been. We were working on this, but it was one of those moments where I thought, okay, I'm going to need to do a few things here just to show that actually we are in control of this. And we did do some structural things, a bit of reorganization as well. Some of it was a little bit for the optics, if I'm honest, but we did move quickly, as I say, to show that we were as on top of this as we could be in the circumstances. And it did work by and large. It did, to the frustration of a lot of colleagues, it did mean there were a lot more meetings for a period of time, and a lot of meetings which were productive, but nonetheless, they, I think, helped to ensure that ministers had a better understanding of what was happening across the service, the way in which people were working together, and that was helpful. So dealing with the unexpected is something that you just need to be prepared for all the time.
Mm. And tell me, how do you think it might change the way the civil service works going forward? I mean, for instance, I have very, very poor connectivity at home, so I'm in the Department of Finance office at the moment, and I was told coming in that there were 20 people here today, and the car park, which is always full, is almost completely empty. Do you see patterns of work changing forever, and what impact will that have on the civil service?
Yeah, I have no doubt that we will never go back to the way we were in January 2020. I saw a recent survey conducted by, it was the First Division Association, the FDA, the Civil Service Trades Union for senior civil servants. And I think it's something like 80–90% of people said they would want in the future to be able to work from home on occasion, maybe not all the time. And I think several things I think we've learned over the last year. I think one is that in the crisis, we collaborated much better together. And actually, I think you maybe want to pick up on this later, but I think during the period of time that ministers were away, the 3 years, I think we had become more collaborative and had broken down a lot of the barriers across departments as well. And we were able to build on that in the pandemic. But the way of working will change. And I think we found that certainly in the short term, in many ways, we were as productive or more productive by having this sort of mixed model of working where people were working from home. Some were obviously still having to work from offices and other areas. And I think there will be a lot more of that in the future. But I think we'll need to make sure we get the balance right, because working from home has been good for some people. It's been tolerable for some people, but it's also, I think, been really difficult for other people as well. And actually, one of the things personally I have found is that the joining the 4 charities that I've joined in recent times, it's much harder to get to know people in a team through Zoom than in face-to-face. So Zoom is okay for people who've been working together for a long time, but for those that are maybe new to a team or new to an organization, it can be much more difficult to actually become part of the team. And I think as well, even for those that are in the organization or have been there for some time, the absence of that face-to-face contact, I think, will increasingly be problematical. I think we need to address that as well.
Yeah, that was actually, I was going to ask you that actually, because it goes back to your principles of leadership, doesn't it? In terms of authenticity and self-awareness and empathy. That seems to me to be very much achievable online if you're dealing with colleagues that you've known for many years. But how do you actually do that with new people? There must be a real challenge for leadership going forward if people are going to be working remotely. And do you have any thoughts about how that might be resolved?
Well, I would be hopeful that with the vaccination program rolling out, that as we move through the spring, people on the call will be much more up to date on how that's all developing. But certainly from a little distance now, clearly the vaccination program has been going very well. And certainly I think we would have to hope that maybe by late spring into the summer, we will be able to sort of meet up a little bit more. Whether we'll ever go back to exactly the way we were before, I'm not so sure. I think social distancing is maybe something that will be with us for some time. It'll be interesting to see whether the handshake ever comes back. But certainly I think from a leadership perspective, I would be hopeful that, come the summer, people will be able to meet up, albeit in a maybe more controlled way than would have happened before. And if we're not able to, I think that will have some big issues for, the smooth running of organizations and indeed for individual well-being as well. Okay.
I want to ask you now, if I may, about the world record that you and your colleagues inadvertently set in terms of running Northern Ireland without an executive and assembly. And I mean, I think to those of us from the outside, as well as those within, it's such a really interesting topic because of, I suppose, what it says about the limits of the civil service, the implications for democracy of what you did, some of the difficulties that you must have had, you just on a day-to-day basis in terms of running departments and running the whole show. So it's more of a kind of open question for reflection about what what that taught you, what you learned from that, what you discovered.
Yeah, do you know something, Nick, I think this is something that would be worth some study at some stage. You know, it's just over a year since the executive was restored. It's a matter of record that we were without ministers for more or less 3 years. We're obviously delighted whenever the executive came back, but we very quickly moved into having to deal with a pandemic. So I don't think we've ever had any real chance to reflect on the learning from that 3-year period. I suppose a few sort of thoughts off the top of my head were, firstly, it was quite extraordinary. And I think certainly if you go back to March 2017, you know, after the Assembly elections, and as we went through that year, and it became clear that the Assembly wasn't coming back quickly, I certainly was on record as saying it's not sustainable not to have ministerial direction. I think it's all wrong in principle, because I think the model of democracy that we're all used to is one where it is people who are elected by the public who take decisions. Civil servants are not the right people to be taking those decisions. And we should never have been put in a position where we were having to, in a sense, act or stand in the shoes of ministers. I think it's a tribute to the NICS that the UK government felt that we could be trusted with this responsibility for 3 years. I think it was an abdication of responsibility on their part. But equally, I'm actually incredibly proud of the way in which the civil service stepped up over those 3 years. And I'll be blunt, I think we did a pretty good job. Now, again, I wouldn't for a second want it to be sort of taken in any way. I think that was the right thing. It clearly isn't the right thing, but in the circumstances, I think we did the best that we could. But I think there's no doubt the absence of ministerial direction has meant that a lot of the long-term problems that need addressed here have become more difficult. I think that's just inevitable. But as I say, for what it was, I think we did the best that we could in the circumstances.
A friend of mine once compared that interregnum period as being like a ship which was set on its course, but didn't have any pilot, just had to carry on the course that it was set. Which made me think about, you know, what would happen if an iceberg had suddenly appeared in front of you. How much of a risk was that? I mean, what would it have been like, for example, if COVID-19 had happened 2 years earlier?
Well, whilst on the one hand, the UK government was prepared to tolerate this, I think they always accepted, and I would have known this from conversations with people in the NIO and indeed with the Cabinet Secretary at the time, that there would come a time when I might have to say, this is intolerable and this cannot go on. And something like a pandemic was always going to be the sort of event that it would have been just completely unacceptable to leave the civil service in charge. When you think about it, you know, government by and large is all about making choices in regard to sort of the allocation of resources, and those choices really should be made by elected politicians. And when you think about the way in which we've had to manage the pandemic, choices have had to be taken on many an occasion, and some of the most difficult choices have been in terms of getting the balance right between managing the transmission of the virus, but at the same time trying to ensure that economic life continues. Civil servants could never and should never have been put in the position of having to make those choices. I was always clear about that. Unfortunately, we got through the 3 years without there being any major issue like that. But nonetheless, there would have been a lot of small things where I think people probably did suffer a little because decisions weren't being taken, and that I think is regrettable.
Yeah. So the whole sort of policy agenda has been set back for at least 3 years, right into the next mandate and beyond, which makes me wonder about, you know, governance in general in Northern Ireland, and you know, perhaps now that you're retired, you can talk a little bit about this. You know, as you know, it raises fundamental questions, doesn't it, about the Good Friday Agreement and the actual government structures that we have in place. Are they robust enough? You know, is that good enough for politics to have completely broken down for that period of time, and an inability to have government, which is a necessity? And if it is unacceptable, what can be done to fix it?
Yeah, that's a hell of a question, Nick, and it's probably not a great week to be answering it either. Claire Archbold from Departmental Solicitor's Office had organised like a sort of mini seminar this week. She had discovered that a lot of the new lawyers in the DSO, when they were talking about the Good Friday Agreement, were saying, "Oh, I was at school at the time and didn't really sort of understand what had gone into that." So she had arranged this, let's say, discussion with Rory Montgomery, who was formerly Department for Foreign Affairs, Alan Weisel from the NIO, and Andrew McCormick, who was around the talks at the time, just giving their perspectives on it. And it was interesting, actually, just the discussion, because I think it was Alan made the point that I think we're all aware of, but sometimes forget, that the Good Friday Agreement was a truly remarkable achievement. But it wasn't primarily about putting good government in place. You know, the primary focus was finding a way of reconciling two traditions, two sides, if you like, that had been in conflict for a very, very long time. And, you know, Mark Durkan very famously said that he hoped that with the passage of time, the ugly architecture holding up the Good Friday Agreement could be removed. And quite clearly that hasn't happened. And I think one of my personal frustrations is that whilst I can't see any alternative to the agreement, it really hasn't over the last 20 plus years delivered good government here. We've had too many collapses, too many decisions not taken, and too many opportunities missed. My reference to this week, you know, again, I think we're seeing the way in which the two main parties have become quite polarized. And when this tends to happen, you tend to find that a lot of the government, the routine government that is needed, becomes much more difficult. So, you know, I'm always reminded of the comment that was attributed to Churchill, although I don't think he was actually the first person that said it, but you know, he said democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. And I think the Good Friday Agreement in many ways is not a great form of government, but we haven't found a better one here. My worry, I suppose, is that, you know, we have assembly elections in May 22. The assembly will rise in March next year, so not much more than 12 months away. I suspect increasingly you will see the parties focusing on that election. And I think that election, and indeed the period of time beyond it, will be defined by debate around the Northern Ireland Protocol and calls for a border vote. And as I say, my frustration is that I think we will struggle to see good government being delivered in that context. And I don't have an easy answer to that.
I suppose nobody has.
Sorry, there's one point I think I want to make. The Good Friday Agreement was remarkable. It is extraordinary. But I think it has relied in the past on there being extraordinary leaders to make it work. And you know, you think back 20 years, I think in particular, you know, for me, the high water mark devolution was probably around 2012, when you had Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness, who on their day were a class act. And when they did their double act, and I heard them speak all around the world, very, very powerful. But I think it's, as I say, it's an extraordinary arrangement. It will need extraordinary leadership to make it work.
Okay. Just on a sort of different topic now, if I may, although you did refer to it earlier on, David, when you were talking about our mutual friend Stephen Nolan and your embarrassment in Washington. They are, I suppose, the lessons that we should be taking from the RHI inquiry, and also, the implications, I suppose, specifically for the civil service and civil service reform. Now, I think we would take it as read that most people, I'm sure, would accept that the civil service does a remarkably good job. But what could be done better in the light of RHI?
Yeah, and I suppose that's a question we've been sort of agonising over, really, since the inquiry report came out, but not just since then. I think it would be wrong, first of all, to imagine the civil service was an organisation that had remained static over time. It's certainly, when I left, it was a very different organisation from the one I joined, and indeed it's a very different organisation from the one I would have known 5-10 years ago. So there has been constant evolution and change. And, I would be the first to say that civil service at its core is a great institution. It has helped hold this place together for many, many years. And, my career goes back to the hunger strikes, the difficulties around the Good Friday Agreement. And I think one of the great strengths of the civil service is that no matter what has been happening outside, people within the civil service from all sorts of backgrounds, all different traditions, have worked together, and remarkably so, even under huge pressure. And I think those strengths are seen in sort of the civil service values, and I think we are a value-based organisation. And then, again, sometimes people can be a little sniffy about the notion of public service, but I work with a lot of people who could be earning more in other organisations. I work with a lot of people who've got a very strong vocation, and I would struggle to think of any civil service colleagues who don't care deeply about this place and who don't want it to be a success. We're here, our families are here, we want it to be a success. But civil service isn't without its weaknesses, and there are issues around capacity and capability. I think that's one thing that was quite clear from the RHI. It takes as much effort to develop a policy for 1.9 million people as it does for 50 million people. So if you have a devolved administration and you have ministers who want to design solutions for Northern Ireland, for this place, then it requires effort, it requires resource. And I think one of the challenges there is we need to be better at drawing in expertise from elsewhere to help us actually design solutions to local problems. And I think a lot of good work has been done on that. And I think the civil service needs to be more open. We need to find ways of bringing people in through secondments, etc., and indeed seconding people out as well. I think certainly there are issues around agility and pace, and I think that this isn't just unique to the Northern Ireland Civil Service, but we're living in a very fast-moving world now, and having administrations that can cope quickly when things change is an ongoing challenge. No easy solutions to that, but that's something that needs to be addressed. Diversity, one of the things I'm proud of is the civil service is a much more diverse organisation today. Gender balance is much, much better than it was even 5 years ago. and it's a place that is much more welcoming to people from the LGBT community. Still a lot to do in other areas, but a lot of progress has been made. I think one of the particular challenges at the moment is age. We are an aging civil service, and we do need to bring a lot more young people in. You know, I contrast today the age profile of civil service with when I joined, and it's completely different. And it's funny talking to my counterparts in Wales and Scotland. They would struggle with similar challenges, and unlike Whitehall, where there's quite a lot of attrition, people move in and out, you know, people here join and they quite like the service, so they tend to stay. So, you know, those are issues that really need to be addressed.
And so I guess from that you wouldn't have been a particular, I mean, you presumably know him or would have come across him quite a bit. You presumably wouldn't be a big fan of Dominic Cummings and his ideas for transformation of it. I mean, they seem to have gone now, don't they? But his ideas for transforming civil service. Or did you see that there was merit in that and it was more just his tone and manner?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the outcome that Dominic Cummings was looking for that is something that almost all senior civil service would share, you know, and some of the frustrations that Cummings had, and somebody else who has obviously talked a lot about civil service reform is Francis Maude, who was obviously brought in the sort of 2010 coalition government, and I think he's reappeared at the moment. I think the mistake that people like Cummings and Maude make is not fully understanding what is needed actually to transform the culture of an organization. And like my experience is, if you come into an organization and you effectively say to everybody, well, do you know what, you're all rubbish. If I could get rid of you all and bring new people in, I would. The fact that I can't means I'm going to have to work with you, but you're all going to have to do better. It's not a great way to enthuse and encourage people to change and do things differently. You know, Kieran Martin, who was the former head of the Cybersecurity Centre and who's from this place, a very good guy, now working for the Blavatnik Institute in Cambridge. You did a short critique recently, which is worth reading, about the Cummings agenda. You know, essentially what Kieran was saying, and I could have seen this myself, is that for all his efforts, really didn't change very much. And that was because they never applied the attention to detail that was really, really necessary if you're going to change culture, etc.
Well, I think I've got a couple of very quick questions for you, David, if I may. And then, as Anne has just put a note out on chat, I'd be very, very keen to broaden the debate before we close. The first one is the kind of thing that most people hate when they get actually in real interviews rather than exit interviews, and that's really about unfinished business. You know, what's the biggest disappointment that you've had during your? I see Tracy's just asking the exact opposite question. What's the biggest disappointment that you've had in your career? What's unfinished business for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I suppose when I think back, one of the strengths of civil service is that you should never get too close to a policy, and you know, because we are impartial, we have to serve different ministers. But you know, from 2003 to 2007, I worked on reforming water and sewage services, and in 2007, and indeed, I'm very proud of actually the way we changed water service into Northern Ireland Water, and that's actually a transformation success. That company, that government company, has done remarkably well in terms of the service it provides and the efficient way in which it operates. But we didn't introduce water charges. Peter Hain, before the executive came back in 2007, accepted the pleas from the local parties not to do so. I think that was a huge mistake. And he gave the executive £100 million to compensate them for the fact that they weren't collecting those charges. I argued at the time, better to reward them for taking that tough decision, because the absence of those charges has probably deprived public services, and that's mainly our schools and our hospitals, our health service, of maybe £2 billion over the period of time since then. And again, my frustration is that one issue encapsulates what has been wrong with successive executives, is their inability to take decisions which, was difficult at the time and which will need some explanation, will make people's lives better here. We are, Paddy Hilliard, who Conor Murphy brought in to do a review of policy at that stage, Professor Paddy Hilliard from Queen's University Belfast, Professor of Sociology, has come out on several occasions, has said that decision has actually hurt the least well-off families in Northern Ireland because of the way in which it has deprived public services of necessary revenue. And as I say, that's a big, big frustration for me. At the sort of lower level, I suppose one of my frustrations again is, again, at the political level, one of the reasons why I perhaps wasn't sorry to go was I had become increasingly impatient with the petty politicking that goes on. On too many occasions when there's a big issue to be discussed, you get the impression that the parties are more interested in scoring political points off each other. Now, I have to be realistic. That's politics for you. But as I say, when you see what needs to be done here that will make this place a better place, and you have to deal with some of that stuff, and it's still going on, I find that really, really frustrating.
Well, look, thank you very much. I'm just going to, if I may now, I think probably it will be a good time to open this discussion up a little bit. And Tracy, I think I think it's only fair, given the question I just asked, David, for you to put yours to him. Tracy Mahaga.
Hi, David.
Hi, Tracy.
Good to see you. No, I suppose I wanted to sort of ask the opposite question, which was, in the long career that you've got, obviously a lot of positives in there. And I suppose when you look back and you reflect, what is the thing that you're most proud of?
Okay, thanks for that, Tracy. A nice question. I like that. And I am proud. I've already said about the way the civil service stepped up during the 3-year hiatus, and indeed helped to bring the executive back last year. I suppose looked at personally, I suppose the most obvious things are the tangible things. And I spoke earlier about 2012 being in many ways what I would have seen as the high watermark for devolution. And that year, we opened Titanic Belfast, and I'm hugely proud of what happened there. It was a public-private partnership involving a lot of organisations. It was hugely different to manage. The project came in on time and on budget. And can you imagine if that project hadn't, if the visitor centre had not been open for the 100th anniversary of the sailing? One of my proudest, I should have brought it, one of my proudest things that I have hanging on my wall is a £10 note, which I got sent to me in a frame about 8 weeks after Titanic Belfast opened. And it was from Howard Hastings. And Howard Hastings had bet me in 2009 that the building would not open in time. And such a gentleman is Howard that he, not only did he send me the tenner, but it was an Ulster Bank £10 note, pristine, which had the Harland and Wolff shipyard and the Titanic on it. As I say, it's a thing I cherish. But it wasn't just the building. I remember, I remember over the years particular moments where you just feel good about yourself in this place. And it was the 31st of March 2012 was the opening night for Titanic Belfast, and it was a black tie dinner. And one of the things that we were concerned about was obviously Peter Robinson, Martin McGuinness were there and both spoke. And obviously Peter Robinson was delighted, his constituency, the shipyard and all the rest. We weren't sure how Martin McGuinness would react. And he gave one of those speeches that I will never forget, where he talked just about the importance of this for Belfast and for the North in his terms for today, but also going forward. But he then went on to talk about how his, I think it was his grandfather, might have been his great-grandfather, had actually been from the Short Strand and had worked in the shipyard himself. And at that moment, and I didn't know this, nobody knew it, but it was one of those moments we just thought, this is a bit special. And then around that time, obviously we had the Our Time, Our Place series of events just to help boost tourism. And, you know, we had the Giant's Causeway Visitor Centre open that year. That was the year we got the second series of Game of Thrones. We got the Irish Open, which led to the Open Championship coming. And if I look at things I'm proud of, going to the Open Championship in 2019. And again, I remember way back, it must have been 2008, 2009, talking to people about my ambition in that regard and being told, you've no chance. And probably one of my proudest moments, that I have to say as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, David. Mark Brown, now you've got a very interesting question.
Hi, David. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Mark. Good to see you.
David, there's been a lot of talk recently about the role of the head of the civil service and how it might change, given that you've been in that position and maybe had time to reflect. I wonder, have you any views on how that role might be potentially reshaped and how that might make it a more productive role, or it'll never be an easy role, but an easier role?
I'm tempted to say no and leave it there. I don't think I want to get into any debate about the recent competition, etc. But I think what I would say is, I remember Malcolm McKibben, my predecessor, saying that the job he did, and he did the job for I think 6 years, and credit to him for that, was not the job he applied for. And similarly, the job I did over the 3 years I was there was not the job I applied for. It is 3 jobs. It is secretary to the executive, it is head of the executive office, and it is de facto head of the civil service. And those are 3 big jobs. Malcolm always said that he was always preoccupied with the first, being secretary to the executive, and having to deal with various crises there. I suppose I had the luxury of being able to spend more time in the absence of ministers doing the sort of overview of the civil service, and I really, really enjoyed that. But I think what I learned during the period, the 8 months before I retired when the executive was back, was that yes, having to support and manage the executive is basically a full-time job. So going forward, I think something's going to need to be done, which just recognises that it'll be very difficult to attend all 3 of those challenges with one person.
You happy, Mark? Grand. So our next question.
Sorry, Nick, just very quickly, just want to see Mark there. Something else I'm incredibly proud of was the work that we did to put in place the recommendations of the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry. And indeed, in the absence of ministers, I think that was a huge achievement, and full credit to Mark and his team who did a magnificent job there.
Thanks, David. You made that a personal issue for yourself. You got involved in it. I think that helped hugely in moving that on.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, thanks for that. Janice Scullin.
Hi, David. It's good to
Hi,
see
Janice. Good to see you.
I suppose my question's a bit of a busman's holiday question. I'm in education now, but if you could set one outcome for the NICS, what would it be?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. An outcome for the NICS or an outcome for Northern Ireland? An outcome for the NICS?
The NICS, yeah.
That's a great question. When I came into the job, I sort of said my ambition for the service, what I would like to see over 3 or 4 years was a service that was delivering an agreed programme for government. Sadly, we're not quite there yet, but I think people have been working very well together. A service where there is much more collaboration. I think that's probably one of the things that really we want. And I think we have seen some good examples of that. And then I think the other thing that's really, really important is continuing to just improve the diversity in the service. Those are things that I always regard as hugely important. And indeed, for all three of those, there'll never be a point in time when you can say, we've succeeded, we've got it done. It'll always be unfinished business, but I would just hope that the sort of positive trend that we've managed to establish continues. That's the best I can do in response to that very good question.
That's not bad. We don't have any more questions from the group, but if anybody does, please post them up, because we do have a few more minutes. But whilst we're waiting for any more, if any, why don't we go right back to the beginning, David? Because I think it'd be fascinating to hear a little bit about your first day in the civil service. Where were you? What happened? What was it like? How did you work?
Oh, Nick, this is embarrassing. I'd served at every grade in the service. So officially, I didn't join the civil service until February 78, and I was a clerical officer, now an admin officer. But actually, in fact, I joined the service on a sort of part-time basis before that as an admin assistant, and that was simply because I had flunked my exams at Queen's. I was doing economics at Queen's and failed first-year exams, and which was a spectacular achievement in those days. Nobody failed first-year exam, but I was sort of a little lost, shall we say, at that stage, a little distracted. And I remember going, my first day I went in and I went into this team in a finance function in what was then the Police Authority for Northern Ireland. And I was put in a team of 3. There was an EO2, a guy called Benny Edwards, who was 60, who smoked 60 a day and loved a bet. And my other colleague was a guy who I remain friendly with to this day, called Kieran Mannion. And Kieran was a bit like me. He had left St. Malachy's at 16 and had sort of drifted into the civil service. And funny, we still keep in touch. And Benny just was a real gentleman from Fermanagh, and he just despaired at what he saw as 2 people who were just wasting their talents. So he's no longer with us, and I wish he could actually see. Kieran retired a couple of years before me and did very well himself as well. I think he was in Dell when he retired. And as I've often said to people, not even my own mother, when I was 20, would have seen a future senior civil servant, never mind a head of the civil service. And I suppose my one regret is 2012 was a good year for me in many ways, but the one really sad thing is I lost my dad that year. I'm just sorry he didn't get to see me becoming head of civil service, because he was a civil servant himself, or had been a civil servant.
Well, thank you. Just one. Yes. This is a really important question I've been suggested to ask you. And in this gathering, there are a lot of people from arm's length bodies and local councils as well here today, David. And obviously you'll be working with them all through the CEF. How can we build better collaboration between arm's length bodies, local authorities, and government going forward?
Yeah, it's really important. I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier, is that at the top of the civil service, much of what it is you want to achieve is actually needs to be done by other people, other organisations, and you know, the vast majority of public servants in Northern Ireland work in arm's length bodies, and the vast majority of money spent and services delivered are from arm's length bodies, and I've got huge respect for them, and indeed for the local councils as well. And I think the collaboration between departments and outside departments with ALBs and councils is improving, but I think there's a lot more we can do. And actually, one of the things that we're working on in CEF at the moment is coming up with a sort of pan-public sector leadership program, because I think we will all be better leaders if we learn and develop together. But one of the other things we're looking at as well is whether we can actually foster more secondments across the different organisations, because if I'm entirely honest, I think sometimes, you know, the civil service doesn't always give arm's length bodies and the councils the sort of respect that they should get. And I think we probably do need to give them their place as well. I think that, as I say, is improving, and I think the collaboration between the top of the civil service and SOLAS, you know, the Local Authority Chief Executives Forum, is really helpful in that regard. But again, I think whoever replaces me long term, I think this is going to be one of the important areas of work for them.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, David. Just one final question, which an anonymous individual asked me to ask you, but I'm sure we'll all find it a fascinating reply. You were talking earlier on, you know, the first question we were talking about how you were just the life and all the rest of it. You did potentially hint at in terms of holidays and the like, but what's on your bucket list?
Yeah, well, funny, I was watching a programme the other evening, Bradley Walsh and his son touring around Slovenia and other places, and the son was encouraging the father to leap off bridges and do bungee jumps and all that. I have no desire to jump out of a plane or jump off a bridge or anything. No, look, and the one thing that I have missed, and largely because of the job, is travel. Now, I've been actually blessed in the civil service. One of the good things about the job is it allowed me to travel. So I've been to the States many times. I've been to China 3 times. China is an amazing country. Now, there are issues around the Chinese government, etc., which pose dilemmas for us. But I would love to go back to China and the Far East. We had actually planned to go to South Africa this January, and so that's on the list. But I'm quite easily pleased. You know, I'm quite happy just tootling around Europe and indeed tootling around Ireland. So no particular ambitions other than, as I say, to do a lot more travelling than I used to.
Thank you. Well, David, I've got no more questions. I just, before I hand back to Anne, I'd just like to thank you for being well, so frank and open. I'm sure people have found this absolutely fascinating. I have. The time has absolutely flown by. I'd certainly wish you every success and every moment of happiness in the next phase of your life. And I'm just, I'm not quite sure whether, Mark, that's your hand up to say something, or whether it's or whether that's oh no, it's applause. Oh, I see. I haven't seen that before. This is me being new to this. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Anne.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, David, for a really illuminating and very frank session. And I think I speak for all our colleagues here today that we really appreciated your approach to it. And for the sake of everyone here today, rest assured that we will be returning to the themes around the nature of the leadership we need in the public sector today, and embedding better collaboration across the public service throughout the CEF programme with David at the helm over coming months and years. So with that, I am going to wrap up today's proceedings. And again, sorry we can't provide lunch for everyone. Hopefully you'll be able to sort that out yourselves today. I look forward to seeing everyone again soon. And thank you, David.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed that.